Definitely. You are listening to the 415ers here on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network. As always, 3 times a week. Evan Giddings, Mark Grandy. I'm on social at eGiddings10. Mark is on social at Mark Grandy. Mark with a C, Grandy with an I. Download, rate, and subscribe. 5 stars only. All right. So let's move on to kind of the real issue, not pontificating about lack of energy, lack of edge, intensity, whatever. The primary issue with the 49ers, and statistically backed up by something you brought up over the weekend, is the fact that Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers have a really hard time coming back from deficits, specifically in the second half. I know that you brought up a number on our last pod. I saw Josh Dubois of the Associated Press put out a similar one, which was Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers in his time there are now 0-24 when trailing by 4 or more points entering the fourth quarter. So that is something that really caught my eye, should catch anyone's eye, the 0. I would understand if it was a terrible record, maybe 4-20, 2-22. That's a disadvantageous position, obviously, to be in. But you're telling me in about 20% of the games that Kyle Shanahan has coached in as a 49ers head coach, in those situations, he has not been able to win a single one of them. Now, there's been a lot of bad seasons. I get it. But even with Jimmy Garoppolo, even with his full complement of defensive studs, he has not been able to do it. So why do these 49ers struggle to come back under Shanahan? I think you kind of hit the nail on the head a few minutes ago, Mark. If they can't run the ball, and when you're down, you large in part can't run the ball, or at least do so at a rate that Kyle Shanahan likes to. So if Jeff Wilson Jr., if, you know, that backfield is not producing at a high rate, and Kyle Shanahan down even sometimes a score is not able to repeatedly put the ball on the ground and pick up 4, maybe 5 yards at a time, if he's not able to methodically move the ball down the field, like ironically he tried to do in the fourth quarter against Atlanta, then this team is going to struggle coming back from down late in games. And we saw it again against Atlanta. We've seen it since 2017, since Kyle Shanahan took over as head coach. And that's something that a lot of fans are fearful of moving forward against better teams like the one that's coming up this weekend.
Yeah, and I think first of all, and I know you did a good job explaining the stat, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands exactly what this stat means. So, 0-26 when entering the fourth quarter, trailing by more than 4 points. That does not mean that the 49ers were down by 7 in the middle of the fourth quarter and they've never come back to win. That happened in the NFC Championship game. But technically, in that game, it was tied going into the fourth quarter. This is specifically at the end of the third, at the start of the fourth quarter stat. When the Niners are down by 4 or more at that moment of the game after 3 quarters under Kyle Shanahan, they are 0-26. They have had fourth quarter comebacks of larger than 4 points under Kyle Shanahan. But again, that was when, say, for example, in the NFC Championship game, it's tied after 3. The Rams, or pardon me, I meant the end of the regular season against the Rams. They are tied after 3. The Rams then score early in the fourth, and then the Niners come back and win. So that makes this stat, moot in relation to that game specifically. So it's
Well,
not to
and they
say,
were down 17 at one point in that game, but that was in
y-
the first half.
yeah, and that's a good point as well. They came back from an even larger deficit, but again, that will not be referenced in this stat because the stat is relatively um, specific about the moment in which the Niners are trailing. So I will say I think the stat is a little bit misleading, and then when you try to relate it to not only Shanahan but Garoppolo, I think you can even take it a step further and wonder how much this really means for the 49ers moving forward or what it tells us about Kyle Shanahan and Jimmy Garoppolo and the current regime. Of the 24 games, I did a little bit of digging. Of those 24 games in which the Niners have trailed by 4 or more under Shanahan at the end of the third quarter, only 6 of those games happened with Jimmy Garoppolo at quarterback. So it's a relatively smaller sample for Jimmy Garoppolo specifically. Now, still winless, 0-6 in those instances when trailing by 4 or more after the third quarter. But I do think that this stat deserves that sort of context because I think it's easy to just see that 0-26 number and easy to say this team has never come back from a fourth quarter deficit. This team cannot, come from behind. Jimmy Garoppolo is a bad quarterback. He's not the answer there. And it's not quite as black and white as that. There's more context that this deserves. Now, there's still a conversation. Why do the 49ers struggle at doing it? I think you're right. It's about the run game. It's about the fact that this is a team, that everything is because of the run game. This team, it kind of works both ways. This stat does. Generally, the 49ers have a lead going into the fourth quarter. They're going to win the game. There's been, some high profile moments where that wasn't the case, unfortunately. The Super Bowl against the Chiefs, the NFC Championship game against the Rams just last year. But generally speaking, you give this team a lead in the fourth quarter, and really you give any team a lead in the fourth quarter, they're more likely to win than lose. But specifically this Niner team, because of their run game, because of their ability to eat clock, we saw that in Atlanta, despite the fact that they were trailing by 14 points in the fourth quarter, which is strange. But generally, that's a drive we see the Niners do when they're up by a score or 10 points in the fourth quarter, and it's the final nail in the opponent's coffin. So I think it works both ways, that this is a Niner team just based on the way that they are made up, the way that they're composed. They're going to struggle to come back from fourth quarter deficits, but they're also going to do a really good job in generally holding on to fourth quarter leads. Just the way that this team is, it's not going to promote those sort of comebacks too often.
Yeah, and look, in 2019, I believe Jimmy Garoppolo had the most fourth quarter comebacks in football. Like, he had 4. Over his career, he's had 10. And that's nothing to scoff at. But when you take a look at the list of quarterbacks that are also around him, look, he's got 10 for his career. Carson Wentz has 11. Nick Foles has 11. Kirk Cousins has 17. So it isn't as if I'm not trying to besmirch Jimmy Garoppolo and Kyle Shanahan. I think that stat is kind of on both of them. But when you look around the rest of the quarterbacks that are, in a similar class to Garoppolo, it isn't as if it's impossible to come back in a fourth quarter. Quarterbacks that are inferior, about the same, maybe a little bit better, have done it at a similar rate. I just wonder, okay, next time the 49ers are going to be down, and there's a strong possibility that it will be on Sunday at about, maybe not 125, but about, I'd say 135, 140 Pacific time, around the time Patrick Mahomes gets the ball on his first drive for the Chiefs. So, pardon me, heads up. Choking right there, like some of these fourth quarters for the Niners. So what I'm basically trying to get at is, like, so then how do you try and combat that? I mean, to me, as much as we've talked about Kyle Shanahan's willingness to pass the ball early in downs in previous episodes, I do wonder if he will try this weekend and moving forward to get back to the run game, knowing that, look, I mean, Jimmy G needs to be in rhythm, but maybe having our running game in rhythm is more important, even if we're trailing in certain games. That's something that I'm going to sort of take note of and keep an eye on, just because against the Chiefs, against maybe even the Rams out after that, like, they're probably going to be down at some point.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and Kyle Shanahan would probably agree with you. He needs to get the run game working. I will say it's probably not going to make the fan base happy, because every time that Kyle Shanahan runs the ball on first down, I mean, there's hundreds of 49er fans on Twitter yelling at him, "Why aren't you throwing the ball? Give us play action. Like, we want to see Jimmy Garoppolo throw the ball downfield to George Kittle and Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel." Like, he can't win, and he's not worried about what 49er fans, are tweeting about during games. But I think it's interesting that the conversation after the Atlanta game has kind of shifted back to, okay, you threw the ball 40 times. Like, let's get the run game going. You rushed for 50 yards. That's unacceptable. But the Niners could rush for 150 yards on the ground and get 5.5 yards per carry. And Niner fans would be saying, all right, we want to see you throw the ball a bit more. You've got these great weapons, and I'm not, throwing this on you at all. I'm just general conversation around this 49er team. It always tends to go that way. I do agree with you that the run game has to be better than it was against Atlanta. That's probably the most obvious statement about this Niner team this season. They simply cannot rush for just 50 yards. And the reality is, regardless of who the quarterback is, at least at this stage, whether it was Trey Lance in his first year as the starter or Jimmy Garoppolo, the offense was not going to be successful without a good run game because everything is built off of the run game. The play action that we saw be so lethal for the 49ers in that year they went to the Super Bowl and played Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. It was because their run game was so great. Raheem Mostert would break big ones every other week, it seemed like. Last year, even with Elijah Mitchell, the run game was fantastic, and it opened up a lot in the pass game. We've seen that for a few games here or there this season, specifically the Rams game and the Panthers game, but it hasn't been, I think, a large enough sample yet that opponents are respecting the run game like they respected past 49er run games to this point. And that is what makes, it more difficult to throw the ball and throw the ball for, 20-yard chunks down the field. I think Garoppolo does deserve a lot of credit for some of the throws he did make against Atlanta. It was some of, the more impressive deep throws I've seen him make in a really long time as a member of the 49ers. But still, it's no secret that the passing game was seriously hampered because of their inability to run the ball. So everything hinges on the run game. If they do not fix that, this team will struggle to win the division. This team will struggle to make the playoffs. But if they do get it right, which I'm fairly confident they will, because Kyle Shanahan generally, is able to scheme up the run game. It obviously didn't work in Atlanta, but I think it will turn around. Then I think that you'll see the passing game open up a little bit more, but that certainly was not the case in Atlanta.
Oh, they'll struggle to make the playoffs.
If you're rushing for under, 75 yards a game, then
yeah, if you're running for 50 a game, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
No, and I do think a lot of that too, to your point earlier about the injuries is, look, obviously you're missing Trent Williams going into the game. Mike McGlinchey gets hurt mid-game. So you're down to your backup tackles. Jake Brendel had he had a tough day against Atlanta. And so maybe the fact that Shanahan didn't necessarily trust the offensive line or the makeshift or musical chairs act that he's referenced before, didn't trust them to be able to run the ball as effectively as he would have liked. Although some parts of that last drive might tell you otherwise.